First tonight, we're going to hear from Nathan Betts. He's an apologist with Ravi Zachis International Ministry. Nathan has written curricula on basic Christianity and apologetics for several major churches in North America and in the UK, and has been featured in Coverage magazine. Nathan also co-wrote and co-presented RZIM's Short Answers to Big Questions video series. He completed his undergraduate degree at Tyndale University and has an MA in Bible and Ministry from King's College London. He's also a graduate of the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Please join me in welcoming up Nathan Betts.
And what a privilege it is for Abdu and I to be here at the University of South Carolina. We've been looking forward to this for a long time, and really, I think the most exciting time for us this evening is the question and answer time. Now, I've just been asked to share for a few minutes on this title, Is Faith Wishful Thinking? Now, when you come to a question like this, it comes to us from at least two different levels. The intellectual level, that is the theoretical level, meaning intellectual curiosity driving the force of the question. It can also come to us from an emotional level, whether it be a crisis or a tragedy. It's those questions that come to us at a very felt level. And it's the latter bit, the emotional level, that I just want to spend a bit of time on before we come to Abdu. A few years ago, I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a leading journalist in Canada, and he's not a Christian, and he's very clear on that. And we were talking about God, faith, life, big issues. And there came a point in the conversation when I said to him, look, why don't you believe in God? Why is it that you don't believe in God? And he looked at me and said, look, Nathan, the thing is, you have to have faith to believe in that God you believe in. And I'm an analytical kind of guy. And it's good. I respect that you have faith to do that, but I can't do that. Again, I'm analytical. And so we spent the next few minutes talking about what he meant by faith and what I meant by faith. And after that, he still seemed a bit just uncomfortable with where we were at in the conversation. So I said, look, let's go further. Why don't you believe in God? And he said, well, look, you can't prove any of this stuff. It's all fake. You can't prove that God is real. You can't prove that even Jesus Christ was a real person. So if you can imagine this conversation, I took the next 10 minutes just to outline for him a few of the historical claims of Christianity, how Christianity, the Christian faith, is rooted in history. After which I looked at him, and I'll be honest with you, I actually thought, okay, now we're getting somewhere in the conversation. And I said, how are we doing now? Have I taken you any steps, even one step further? And he said, look, no, not really. So it was a bit of a killjoy for me, that moment. And I said, look, I think I know why you don't believe in God, but what would it take? What would it take for you to believe in God? And he looked at me and he said, look, Nathan, the proof thing is one thing. The evidence is one thing. But in order for me to believe in God, I'd have to change the way I live. The people I hang around with, the language I use, and I don't want to do that. Now, why do I share this story? I share this story because what I found, just through observations, through being in conversations, just speaking to groups like this, is that when we get into conversations of faith, one person has put it like this: we are witnessing attitudes masquerading as ideas and emotional commitments disguised as intellectual honesty. Now, it's not always the case, but somehow when we get into conversation of faith, this is, I'm taking this from a guy named David Bentley Hart. He says, we're witnessing attitudes masquerading as ideas, emotional commitments disguised as intellectual honesty. That's why I really admire my friend in that moment, who said, look, I'll be honest with you, it's not the proof thing. It's actually, I just don't want to change the way I live. It's too much. Now, I just want to point out for you two assumptions hidden in my friend's comments. The one assumption that you may have picked up on, you might have missed, is this: that when you come to believe in the Christian God, you will be let down. That when you come to believe in the Christian God, you'll be disappointed, as if it's a retrograde step. Now, when we look to the Christian faith, the scriptures, we see actually that nothing could be further from the truth. There's a story told of Jesus Christ, God in flesh, interacting with one of his friends. This is found in Luke. The Bible, if you're not familiar with it, is really comprised of two sections, the Old Testament and New Testament. In the New Testament, you see 4 books that show us eyewitness accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus. Luke is one of those books, and he's giving us an eyewitness account of a conversation between Jesus Christ and a guy named Peter, one of his friends. Peter is a fisherman. Jesus is known as a rabbi. And the story takes a strange twist when Jesus, the rabbi, remember, gives Peter, the fisherman, fishing advice. Now it's very absurd, but he looks to Peter and says, look, put your nets out into the deep. And it doesn't really make sense because back then, and still today, even in the Sea of Galilee, the fish aren't out in the deep, they're near the shore. And they just had an unfruitful night of fishing. So Peter, reluctantly and incredulously, still does it. He puts his nets out into the deep. And then something remarkable happens. He comes into a lottery-sized catch of fish. The strange moment comes when Peter looks to Jesus and he says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Peter, whether he knows it or not, is confronted with God in the flesh. And this is what he says. Now here's the point. After all this happens, he and his colleagues see this dramatic catch of fish. They say that they were astonished. Luke, the narrator, actually says they were astonished at the catch of fish. Here's the thing. When people encounter Christ, if you read the Gospels, if you read the New Testament, the 2 words often used to describe people's affections, people's feelings, people's thoughts when they encounter Christ are the 2 words amazement and astonishment. Now this evening, Abdu is going to be sharing on this theme. Is faith in God wishful thinking? And for some of you, the evidential claims are going to help immensely. But I wonder if there are some in this room who actually might find the emotional commitment to Christ, to the Christian God, a huge challenge. You might look at this theme and say, well, even if it is true, well, I'll be let down. What if I'll be disappointed? Well, even if it is true, I don't want it to be true. The scriptures tell us that when those who meet God, that's when life begins. Newness. Scriptures, the story of Christianity, and I would say even my own life, I can say that I've experienced this new life. The second assumption in my friend's comments is that if you believe in God, you need to change the way you live immediately. Do you remember that? My friend said, look, in order for me to believe in God, I need to change the way I live. The amazing news of Christianity is that you come the way you are. Now, there will be change. Might be very dramatic change, but he's the one who does that. It's just on us to trust in him, to cooperate with him. I found this to be true in my own life. As a teenager, I remember, even though I had grown up in the church, I knew all the stuff about Christianity. I came to a point at which I realized the difference between knowing about the Christian God as just ideas, principles, and knowing him as a person. The difference between ideas to be understood and a person to be known. I found true life. I experienced, and I continue to experience that amazement, that astonishment. So this evening, as we consider and explore this question, is faith wishful thinking? And you might find the commitment to the Christian God emotionally very challenging. I want to suggest to you, 1, when you commit your life to this God, life will just be beginning for you. And it will not be a retrograde step. It will be a step forward. Come just the way you are. Come just the way you are. That's the way God wants you to come. He does the change. Come just the way you are. New life, amazement, astonishment. Come as you are. This is the gift that is offered to us in Christ Jesus. God in human flesh. Thank you.
Next this evening, we'll be hearing from Abdu Murray. Abdu is the North American director of Ravi Zachis International Ministries and the author of 2 books, including his latest, Grand Central Question. For most of his life, Abdu was a proud Muslim who studied the Quran and Islam. After a 9-year investigation into the historical, philosophical, and scientific underpinnings of major world religions and views, he discovered that the historic Christian faith alone can answer the questions of the mind and the longings of the heart. He holds a BA in psychology from the University of Michigan and earned his Juris Doctor from the University of Michigan Law School. As an attorney, he's been named in Best Lawyers in America and Michigan Super Lawyer several times. Please join me in welcoming Abdu Murray.
Well, thank you so much for having Nathan and I. It's been a real pleasure to be here for the past couple of days. I recognize that some of us are actually a little bit worried about the hurricane coming in, Friday or something? What I'm hoping to not do, by the way, in the next 45, maybe even shorter minutes than that, is not have you think the hurricane already arrived because the tall windbag won't stop talking. But I hope that won't be the case, and I hope we can engage on some, I think, very, profound and important material, which I think you also think as well, because you're here today. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think it was important. So thank you for coming. Now, we're talking about this idea of, is faith just wishful thinking? And it reminds me of a story I heard a while back. It's a humorous story, I hope you find it humorous at least, of a guy who was walking by a travel agency. He's walking downtown, so he's a travel agency, and there's a sign there, and it says, River Cruise, $100. And the guy's like, River Cruise, $100? That's a steal. So he walks in, puts his money down at the counter and says, I'll take one. And next thing he knows, he gets hit over the head. Bam! Knocked unconscious. He wakes up and he finds himself in a barrel floating down a river. And he looks over and there's another guy on the same river floating in a barrel. He rubs his head and he says, hey, do they serve lunch on this cruise? And the guy says, I don't know, but they didn't last year. I think people often think of people of faith as the second guy, that he had evidence that what he was buying into wasn't worth it. Yet he did it over and over again. And people think of matters of faith in this way, that you simply believe something without evidence or believe something in the face of strong contradictory evidence, and that's wishful thinking at best or delusional at worst. Richard Dawkins makes this statement in his book, The God Delusion. He says, a delusion is a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence, especially as a symptom of a psychiatric disorder. God is a delusion and a pernicious delusion. When one person suffers from a delusion, it's called insanity. When many suffer from it, it's called religion. Now that's quite a statement. But is that a fair way to characterize faith? Now, whether you come from a faith of, a Muslim faith or a Jewish faith or a other Eastern religion or whatever it might be, that's another question. What I'm here to talk about is whether this is a fair characterization of biblical faith. I think oftentimes we find caricatures of faith. In other words, these straw men or these meme-like things. Today we seem to argue in memes. We don't really argue with arguments. We just post on memes, and then they're cleverly stated. There's a couple of things out there. I heard there's one about me and the hurricane, by the way. That makes me laugh a little bit. But these are arguments nowadays. We have these sort of caricatures of what faith actually is. And when you think about it, for example, people often say that faith in God is like faith in Santa Claus. You believed in Santa Claus as a kid, but when you knew better, you grew up out of it. For some reason, faith in God may be a little more sophisticated, so you just need to grow up a little bit more, and eventually you'll lose your faith in that kind of a thing, because it's no better than faith in Santa Claus. This usually stems, by the way, these caricatures stem from a flawed understanding of what we mean by God when we talk about God. Oftentimes, I think the skeptic rejects a God that I would be very comfortable rejecting as well. And I've had my atheist friends tell me, I don't believe in God. Well, what's God like? And they tell me what God is like, and I'm like, well, good. I don't believe in that God either. I'm as atheistic about that God as you are. Because we oftentimes have a mischaracterization of what it is. And so the Santa Claus analogy seems to pertain. So someone says you believe in God like you believe in Santa Claus. Here's a distinction, though. Belief in God is so much more powerful because of the object of the belief. John Lennox puts it this way, with his triple doctorates from Oxford, puts it this way. Have you ever met somebody who came to believe in Santa Claus? No one eventually believes in Santa Claus. People eventually do believe in God, intelligent people. People lose their faith in Santa Claus the older they get. But people, very intelligent people, come to believe in God because there's reasons to do that. Diametrically opposed ideas. We have to break this idea of what faith actually is. The character of the concepts is fundamentally and radically different. But what does faith actually mean? See, people characterize faith as this delusional idea of believing something in the face of no evidence or strong contrary evidence. What I want to share with you today is that faith, as defined by the Bible, is not defined this way. Sadly, I think Christians are the perpetrators of this idea of faith being a blind leap or belief without knowledge or belief without evidence. We are oftentimes the one who say that and believe it that way. What's interesting is the Bible does not describe faith in this way at all. You will never see an instance where the Bible actually commends someone for believing something for no good reason, especially about God. He usually gives them reasons or ideas or proofs to back up why they believe, why they should believe Him and trust Him. When you look at the definition of faith in the Bible, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it says something interesting. It defines faith this way. It says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is the substance of hope. We oftentimes equate faith and hope as if they're the same thing. You know, we hope something is true, or I hope this happens, whatever it might be. That isn't the case, because if faith and hope meant the same thing, that sentence I just read for you out of Hebrews would make no sense. Faith isn't hope. Faith is the substance of hope. Hope is an expectation of a future positive event or occurrence. Faith is trusting the one who said it will happen. Do you see the distinction? Faith, the Greek word, in fact, in the Bible means trust. It means active trust. Everybody in this room has faith. Every single person in this room. Almost everyone here is sitting down. Now, when you sat in that chair, did you go like this and make sure it can hold you up? Did you grab one of those sandbags and drop it and pick it up and drop it to make sure that the chair was strong enough for you? You didn't have direct evidence that the chair would hold you up. Maybe you came here in a car. If you came here in a car, did you test the brakes? Why not test the brakes? For heaven's sake, they could go out. You could die in a fiery car wreck. Test the brakes, for heaven's sake. But you didn't do that. Why? Because you had enough evidence from the previous performance of the car, from the previous performance of these chairs, from the fact that you've seen people maybe even bigger than you sit in these chairs. And you've had enough evidence to sit down and say, I can trust my weight to this chair. One day, this chair will fail. If the laws of physics apply to the chair, and they sure do, one day it just won't hold you up anymore, and you'll be the unhappy recipient, maybe, of a chair failure. I happened to be that recipient one day in a very public sense. It was embarrassing. My faith in the chair was not well placed, although I had enough evidence. Sometimes we don't have enough evidence to believe, and sometimes we have just enough. Faith is where you have enough evidence to believe something and go ahead and trust it. Everyone in this room, I don't care what your worldview is, you have faith. If you're a scientist, you have to have faith based on prior scholarship, based on prior work of other scientists. You have to understand that they're reporting. They're not lying to you in their reporting, whatever it might be. We all have it. We all have it. The question isn't, do you have faith? The question is, what is the strength of the object in which you place that faith? Is the object in which you trust worthy of that trust? That's the question. I want to give you 3 ways, friends, in which we can know that trusting God, specifically the God of the Bible, is not wishful thinking, that it's more than that, based on good evidence and good reasons. And then I want to offer, as I wrap it all up, that from these 3 reasons, we have a reason that our trust can be the substance of that which we hope for. So what am I talking about here? The first point is this, that the evidence from the physical world actually makes faith in God be more than just wishful thinking. For example, the evidence that things exist at all. Scientists will tell you that the universe is a contingent thing. All the physical things in the universe and all the matter and energy and space and time, it's contingent. Whether it's eternal or it actually had a beginning, it's all contingent. It doesn't explain its own existence. Everything that's physical in the universe or energy, whatever it might be, needs an explanation for why it exists. So the cause of those things must be something that does not need its explanation. You have to have a final or as Aristotle and Plato and all these big boys talked about, an uncaused cause or an unmoved mover to explain these things. But then you look at standard Big Bang cosmology, for example. The standard model of Big Bang cosmology tells us that the universe, all matter, energy, space, and time, began to exist at a finite point in the past. Matter, energy, space, and time all began to exist. Therefore, the thing that caused them can't be material. It has to have more collective energy than the entire universe. It has to be spaceless and has to be timeless. That is the very definition of, classically speaking, of what a transcendent being is. A timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful being. Matter, energy, space, and time can't have been caused by a material cause because those things can't create themselves. So by definition, you have to have that. But then you look at not only the explanation for the beginning of the universe, but then you look at the way the universe is arranged. Not only did it have a beginning that can't explain itself, but it has an arrangement that cries out for an explanation. It's a thing called fine-tuning, and maybe you've heard the topic or the idea before, and if you're in engineering or if you're in the sciences, you know what fine-tuning is. The fine-tuning principle about the universe is something that's theologically neutral. Atheists and Christians, or theists of some kind, will all talk about fine-tuning as a thing that's a phenomenon in the universe. The explanation's a different story. What do I mean by fine-tuning? What I mean is that there are certain properties of the universe, both in its initial conditions and in its current state, that if any one of about 40 or more, one scientist friend I have says there's about 200 of these actually, if any one of them are off by the most infinitesimal amount, no life is possible anywhere in the universe in any form whatsoever. Give you a couple of examples of this. Roger Penrose from Oxford University, not himself a Christian, of course, calculated that the odds of the Big Bang's low entropy conditions, in other words, the organization of the matter and the energy at the Big Bang's initial conditions, the possibility of that happening by chance is on the order of 1 out of 10 to the 10th power to the 123rd power. If you understand math, you understand the magnitude of that number. But if you're like me and you went to law school, you don't understand the magnitude of that number. That's a 10 with 10 zeros multiplied by itself 123 times. It's unbelievable. Astronomical. Well, quite literally astronomical. But then you look, and Stephen Hawking, again, not a Christian, not even a believer in God, when he looks at all these properties and he says the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. What I'm trying to point out to you from the strong forces and the expansion forces and the rate of the universe and the gravitational fields and all these all could have been different. They didn't have to be this way. They could have been different. And if they were different by a hair's breadth, any one of them, let alone all of them, no life possible anywhere in the universe. As Frederick Hoyle said, it looks like someone's been monkeying with the physics. It looks like choices were made. Now this is interesting because if the constants and quantities could have been different, and we know they could have been different about the universe, that suggests that choices were made for a purpose, and the purpose was life. So if we have all matter, energy, space, and time coming to existence and needing an explanation for their existence, you have to have an immaterial, enormously powerful, spaceless, and timeless being who creates all these things, and that being is capable of making choices. Not only is it a transcendent being, but it's a personal being as well, and that is the classical definition of God. So we can see that the physical universe begins to cry out for an explanation, and that people who've put their faith in a God who explanation there are not just engaging in wishful thinking. But then you see the design of life and the way life itself, the universe is designed so that life can exist, but the life that does exist cries out for this. There's a field, an emerging field called biomimetics. Maybe you're familiar with this idea. Biomimetics is an engineering field now. It's a thing that engineers are doing where they're looking at life forms, whether they're biochemical machines or larger macro machines, and the way they work, the way certain parts of the biology works, they're saying, we have these engineering problems. We need to fix this. We need to create a new engine that does a certain thing, or a turbine that does certain kinds of functions, and we can't figure out the engineering issue. So what we do is we reverse engineer what we find in nature, the machines, the chemical parts and the physical parts of living things, and say, I wonder if there's an answer there. And we find the answers there, and they reverse engineer the design for their engineering product based on the way a living thing actually works. So here's the question. If the living thing can be a design template for a product of engineering that our finest minds come up with, how is the living thing an accident? You see what I'm saying? The living thing is the template for design, yet we claim that it's not designed. And we use it for our best designs. We're seeing some amazing things here. Now, as an aside, Francis Crick, who discovered the structure of DNA, said, when you look at these things, as a scientist, he warned scientists, you're going to look at these things and they're going to look like they're designed. And the inference is going to be so powerful, you must constantly remind yourself it's not designed, it's evolved, and it's evolved blindly. The whole reason he has to do that is because of the strength of the design inference from looking at the organisms themselves. They have what's called specified complexity. They're not just complex, that's nothing. They're complex in a way that performs a function, and that's something altogether different. Biomimetics is showing us this. So we look to these machines that are in the physical world, that are in the living organisms, and we see incredible design. A design so great that we copy it. We steal it. We can't even come up with it on our own, with our mind. How is that mindless? And it's a funny thing when you look at the book of Job, and it tells you in chapter 12, verses 7 to 9, ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of heavens, and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fishes of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? Science today is telling us if you look at the beasts and the birds and the fish of the sea, they will tell you how to make things and how things are made. The Bible said that 3,500 years ago. It's remarkable. And then you come down to the DNA itself, the thing that makes you and I up. Trillions of DNA strands in your body. When Francis Collins, who is the director of the National Institutes of Health and the Human Genome Project, himself a believer, his team unraveled and decoded finally all of the human genome and discovered 3.1 billion bits of information. That's more information in one DNA strand than some graduate libraries have in the entire library. In one DNA strand. If you were to read the four-letter sequence of DNA at the rate of 3 letters per second, one DNA strand would take you 31 years to read out loud if you never stopped to take a break. All of that information for creating a human being. Remarkable. And when you see what it actually looks like, the double helix, but then also looking at it through its axis, you begin to see an artistry there that goes beyond just a construction, that goes beyond just the sort of chemical bringing together of something. The way, if you ever see the models that show you how DNA goes into the ribosomes and into the subnucleal structures and zips up and then unzips itself to replicate, the beautiful dance that ensues there, you see this artistry. And it shows you something, friends. It shows you beyond just that you were built or designed or constructed as a chemical machine. There's something more to you than that. The Bible doesn't describe you and me this way. The Bible describes you as more than just built or designed or structured. In Psalm 139, the Bible says you were knit together in your mother's womb. Now, when I say the word knit, what do you think of? The first thing you think of is a paternal figure, some kind of parental figure knitting something together for a child. That care. Yes, it's designed. Yes, there's a template. But there's that emotion invested. There's that intimacy invested there. You know, I'm from Michigan, so unlike people in South Carolina, it's super cold up there. And I got a lot of sweaters. And all those sweaters, almost every one of them, in fact, every one of them, was bought for me or I bought myself. So they have monetary value, but little else. Well, they're useful because they keep me warm. But I have one sweater in my home that's useless to me. It does not perform any functions whatsoever, and it won't even fit on my right hand. It's this little purple sweater my mother knit when she was pregnant with me to bring me home in the hospital after giving birth. Why is that so sentimental to me, this little purple sweater? This purple sweater I brought all my kids home from the hospital in. Why is that sentimental to me? Because as my mother was knitting it, yes, she used a template and she used a design, but she thought of her boy. She knitted. She did the cross stitch loop, whatever you do when you knit. She was doing that, and she thought, my boy, my son, Abdu, my boy. You were knit together in your mother's womb. You're not a chemical machine. The science begins to show us this and gives hints of this, that we are more than that. So we look at the physical universe and the physicality inside of us to see that there's something more to us than just the physical. And then we begin to see our sense of human value and dignity. Now, everybody in this room, that's number 2, everybody in this room, I hope you feel this way. My guess is you do. You think that human beings have objective value, and maybe you think they have purpose as well. My guess is you all feel that way. Objective value. The human being's value, the value of one person doesn't depend on the opinions of other people. If it depended on human opinion, it would be subjective, wouldn't it? And how would you know that this person is valuable? Well, he's got to be assigned or she's got to be assigned value by other people. And if they don't value them, well, then get rid of them. We see this now and again. We see it quite pervasive in our day, in fact. We have never been more educated than we are now. We've never found more ingenious ways to kill each other and devalue each other. Despite all education, racism still exists. Despite all education, genocide still happens in the world. Despite all these things still happen. If human value is based on human opinion, it's a terrible test for it because it keeps failing over and over again. But we recognize there's an objective human value, which means it has to be beyond human opinion. Well, if man is the measure of all things, as Protagoras once said, then all there is human opinion. But is there something more, something higher, something transcendent that ascribes value to you and to me, beyond your DNA, beyond your place of birth, beyond your socioeconomic status? Is there more? There has to be. Something more. Morality, which gives to us the categories of value, is objective only if there's a standard of objective morality above and beyond us. Now, moral properties are not just things that float out there. You know, you don't say, oh, there goes justice, look at justice. Or you don't say, look at kindness being so kind. Isn't kindness just so great? No one does that because kindness can't be kind, and if kindness can't be kind, then kindness violates itself. So these ideas of moral values and obligations, they don't just exist out there and float about, blah, 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 like that. There has to be a rooting, a grounding of these things. They're personal qualities. Things aren't just, persons are just. Things aren't kind, persons are kind. But if there's a transcendent, objective morality, then those moral values, which are personal, have to be rooted in an objective, transcendent person. That is also the classical definition of God. A transcendent, moral person who does not depend on your opinion or mine. And you have that value irrespective of what society may tell you, your friends may tell you, your non-friends may tell you, or even your professors may tell you. You have that value. In fact, the atheists who study this, who are the big heavy hitters in philosophy, who study this stuff will tell you we've struggled long and hard to try to find an objective source for morality, whether it's evolution, whether it's reason, whatever it might be, but there is no objective morality absent God. Let me quote one for you. Professor Joel Marks out of the University of New Haven spent a lot of time writing columns of paper and spilling a lot of ink trying to justify morality and human value absent God's existence. And then he has what he calls his reverse epiphany, that he was wrong. He says this: the long and short of it is that I became convinced that atheism implies amorality. And since I'm an atheist, I must therefore embrace amorality. I experienced my shocking epiphany that the religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality, but they are incorrect, I still believe, about there being a God. Hence, I believe there is no morality. Kai Nielsen will say the same thing. J.L. Mackie will say the same thing. You go on and you name them. They say the same thing. Now, be careful here, of course, and listen to what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you have to believe in God to be a good person or to act like a good person. I'm not saying that at all. I have friends who do not believe in God in the least bit, and they are very moral people. They act with a very strong moral code. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the idea of objective morality, that it actually exists as a category, makes no sense absent a transcendent authority to give it. In other words, we're just play acting at this. Michael Ruse, an atheist philosopher, makes the exact same statement when I talk about evolution as the source of morality. He says, you may think that you're being moral when you act in a moral way, but you're just fooling yourself. Morality is just an illusion foisted upon you by your genes to get you to be a social cooperator. And now that you know that, what's to prevent you from behaving like a pagan Roman? Well, nothing, he says, in an objective sense. Yet you recognize that morality because that morality leads to human value. Why do we have protests nowadays decrying the treatment of others as if they're just chattel or whatever it is to get in the way? Because we all fundamentally recognize that human beings have an inherent value. But that value also leads to something else. It leads to a sense of meaning. We're all looking for that sense of meaning. Now, some of us might say there is no such thing as meaning. It's all an illusion and all these things, but you don't act like it. You're at this university, for example. Why are you studying what you're studying? Why are you working towards what you're working? If you're not coming to this school, you're doing some other kind of work. I hope you are, and if you can't, then I hope someone's helping you out. But why are we doing this? To collect knowledge just for the sake of collecting knowledge because my parents told me to? I get a free ride to go party someplace? Are you doing it for those reasons? Maybe those are part of the reasons, but if there's probably hopefully better reasons than that. Maybe the reason is because you recognize that whatever calling you're going into, whether it be in the medical field, whether it be in the sciences, whether it be in philosophy, whether it be in literature, whatever it might be, you're contributing to society. Your work has meaning beyond the accretion of knowledge or just shifting papers around. Because there's a purpose to humanity. There's got to be more to it than that. I think God makes sense of that. We have this moral value that tells us we're valuable, we have a purpose, and then you exercise that or you express that through your calling, whatever it might be, whatever you're pursuing in your academic studies. We need that. We need you to do that desperately because God inspires the imagination. God, if you look at any historian, will tell you, God is the single greatest source of inspiration for the greatest works of art and even science itself. Copernicus, Galileo, Tycho Brahe, Isaac Newton, all these big, Gregor Mendel, all these big boys will tell you that they began their scientific endeavor out of a reverence for a creator who created this huge tapestry for them to explore. And they say, oh God, as I explore your universe, I find myself thinking your thoughts after you. It's the inspiration for this. But God has inspired many things of imagination. Now, Santa Claus might inspire children's chimes and jingles. And he might inspire paintings that go on the side of Coke cans. But you know what he doesn't inspire? God doesn't inspire Mozart's Requiem. Santa Claus, I should say. I was saying God. Santa Claus inspires Coke cans and children's jingles. God inspires Mozart's Requiem and the Sistine Chapel. That's the source of what he can do for you and for me and see these great works of art. But I read the words of Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And he says this, very often we tie down the notion of belief to having a quick answer to what you think is true out there, rather than how do you inhabit the world you're in, the speech you speak, the vision you see. One of the things that most needs saying to the culture despisers of religion today is that the classical language of faith is overflowing with resources for imagining and understanding human experience and value at depth. As I've said on other occasions, when people compare Christian belief to the belief in the tooth fairy or Santa Claus, I want to ask, where are the divine comedies or the Matthew Passions or the four quartets inspired by the tooth fairy? Not only do we have moral value and purpose, but imagination and that which makes life flavorful, savory, is inspired often by God. And he gives meaning to our academic and professional pursuits. You know, a few months ago, I was following a popular book written by a very, very well-known judge, a federal judge here in the United States, and someone I admire, actually, in terms of his legal acumen. He has written some of the most influential opinions in the history of the United States. And he was giving an interview, and he made this statement. He says, as far as I'm concerned, we're all just apes with big brains. And I thought, how disappointing is that? Because he just got done telling us about the calling of judges to adjudicate matters of ultimate importance and policy considerations for the wider society. So my question is this: how can he actually think he's doing that by adjudicating matters of ultimate importance between actual people when he thinks we're just apes with big brains? How is he not just a zookeeper who prevents the animals from biting each other? Your academic career will lead to something meaningful. Your manual labor will lead to something meaningful if there's something beyond us, far more important. Barney Adler is a former Christian. He turned atheist and wrote a book called Save Me, an open letter to the Christian church. And he says he laments that meaning is gone, that all these things are gone in his life, and he misses them. This is what Barney says. Through atheism, I have learned to shun these ideas as nothing more than religious superstition. Comfort it may be, meaning religion, but it is only from an imaginary friend. Yet I miss this friend more than words can say. Like an alcoholic looking at a glass of whiskey, I long so much to revive my old habits. I wish to call on God again, to repent, to be made new. But then I wake up to reality. There is no comfort in pain. There is no God to go to. There is no Jesus to bear my afflictions for me. There is only this harsh world, and it gives mercy to no one. God help me. Is that how life actually is? Or is there more? There's a universe that points to the existence of life as finely tuned so that life could exist, and that life itself, which paints this beautiful portrait of what it means to be a human being as knit together in the mother's womb for a purpose, so that we can have dignity and value and morality, show us that we're more than that. What is that purpose? You know, I travel a lot for work, of course. We travel all over the world to do this kind of work and offer the credibility of the gospel to audiences both friendly and hostile. So I'm in hotels a lot. Now, I can't work in total silence. I have a hard time working in total silence. Silence distracts me because I have 3 children, and I discovered something when I was working home one day. If I'm at work, if I'm at home working and there's 3 kids in the house and there's total silence, that's a bad thing. Because somebody knocked somebody out and is not telling anybody. They're trying to keep it under the rug. So I get distracted, need to go find out what's wrong. So I was in this hotel one time, and I had to get some kind of background noise. This is before I got Spotify. I had to find some background noise and find a television show that wouldn't interest me so much that I watched it, but also could serve as background noise. So I'm flipping through the channels, and I come across a television show you may have seen called Everyone Loves Raymond. It's a show about this guy who's a father who means well, but he screws something up in the beginning. His wife yells at him until he figures it out. That's kind of the show in a nutshell. Well, in this particular instance, his daughter asked him a question: where do babies come from? Where do people come from? And he has to have the talk, so he tells her something about storks, I think it was. And, which is obviously wrong. You know that, right? So his wife says, Ray, you can't tell her that, because if you tell her that, she's going to find out the truth from her friends or some other source and not trust us with the big questions. Go fix this. Well, he's terrified to talk to his daughter about this, so the whole half hour is him. By the way, you can totally tell I got no work done for this half hour. He spends the half hour trying to figure out how to have the talk with his daughter. So he finally walks into her bedroom. There she is sitting on the bed playing with her dolls. He sits down next to her and says, honey, you asked Daddy a very important question. Now, when a man and a woman love each other, they get married and come together, and she says, whoa, Dad, stop, please stop. I already know that. Why does God put us here? He's not ready for that question. It's the meaning of life question, right? The question no one knows the answer to. Why are we here? What's the purpose of humanity? Every time you see it in the movies, it's some guy, it's Forrest Gump running across America, getting his beard all long, and he's got the answer somehow, because I guess running gets the answers to life. But also climbing mountains does too. As the guy climbs to the top of the mountain, he's all torn apart and his beard's getting long too. And there's a guy sitting at the top of the mountain in the lotus position with eyebrows that won't quit, chanting something. And then the guy says, oh, great guru, tell me what the answer to the meaning of life is. And as he opens his mouth, cuts the commercial. Well, she asks him what the meaning of life is, and he doesn't know what the meaning of life is. So he says, God puts us here because heaven is crowded. It's ridiculous, of course. But the whole point is that we don't know this answer, right? It's summed up very, very easily in the Westminster Shorter Confession. The chief end of man is to glorify God and delight in his presence forever. That last part's pretty important. You are here for relationship. You are here to have a relationship with the Creator. Now, everyone in this room either has relationships, craves relationships, protects relationships, or mourns the loss of relationships. You are an incurably relational being. That is who you are. What explains that? By the way, it's not a matter of just herding together for protection's sake. Cows do that. Apes do that. But they don't love each other. They don't mourn their losses the way we mourn our losses. They just don't do it that way. Yes, they exhibit some mourning activities sometimes, but there's no connection. They don't write songs about their loved ones. Why do you have that? It's of little to no evolutionary value whatsoever. What explains the depth of your relational quality? A universe that created you out of nothing, that didn't have you in mind, that itself was created mindlessly? Or a being who defines relationship, creating you to have relationship? That's the purpose. That's the meaning to all this. The universe cries out, and the evidence of history, if I can just wrap up this last point on this, the evidence of history gives us the evidence for why you're created and that relationship can be restored. The Bible narrative is this, that we were created for relationship and we rejected it. The relationship-giving God created us, we rejected it, and he said, thy will be done, and we separated ourselves from him, and we're living in the state we're living in now. But being the God that he is, he does not leave you there. He does not leave you in a position to just flounder about. He offers himself. He himself comes down, not sends someone. He himself comes down, offers you that forgiveness because he pays a penalty that you and I deserve to pay. Everyone in this room does. We all deserve to pay that, but he pays it instead so that you don't have to, so you can be with him, and there's this reconciliation that happens, you to God himself, to restore that relationship. This is not a matter of opinion. Honestly, friends, if I can say it so boldly, when you look at the history behind the resurrection of Jesus, I've debated this with atheists and non-Christians of different stripes many, many times. Just got done doing it with John Loftus, the atheist. You can see it on YouTube. The evidence for the resurrection, and I won't go into it because time doesn't allow, maybe during the Q&A. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, the historical facts, four main facts that all scholars, or nearly all scholars, whether they're Christian or non-Christian alike, agree about the life of Jesus, point to, I think, in a powerful way, the fact of his crucifixion and the fact of his resurrection. So I'm talking about belief in God, but I want to come down and narrow it down to belief in Jesus specifically. Why him and no other? Because he is the only one who died and rose. And he made some very interesting claims about himself, that he died for the sins of the world and he rose to give us life. Why do I believe him? Because he rose from the dead, and a guy who rises from the dead has credibility. He does that for you and for me. Let me wrap this up in a story, if you don't mind my doing it quickly. A friend of mine who was not a Christian was in town on business, invited me out to dinner, and I said, fine, if you pay, I'll pray. And he did, business expense. We had a nice time. We caught up on family and other things. Now, he is an atheist. I was not a Christian at the time we were in school together, and he found out I was a Christian. The subtle hint was he came to my wedding at a church, and he thought, I think this guy's a Christian. It was a subtle hint. And he asked me how that happened. We got into issues of faith. And we talked about fine-tuning and moral values and all. We had a really great conversation. Very, very bright guy. Great conversation. And towards the end, he said, I have a hard time believing that this God exists that you talk about if there's such sorrow and evil and suffering in the world. Because if God is all-powerful, he could stop the evil and suffering. If God was all good, he would want to stop the evil and suffering. But he hasn't stopped the evil and the suffering, so he's either not all-powerful, or he's not all good, or, better yet, he's not there. Now that's a hard one. That's dinner conversation for you, right? That makes your tea grow cold sitting on the table. Well, our coffee and tea did grow cold. All the people had left by now, and the waitstaff was wondering when will the Martians leave finally. We had this discussion, and I said, look, there's a couple answers to this. There's like 4 or 5 answers to this issue, actually. And most philosophers will tell you this. One of those stems from the idea if God exists, he's not logically incompatible with evil and suffering, because if he exists, then he has knowledge of what would happen in the future and what will happen in the future. So it's quite possible that God could have morally sufficient reasons to allow some suffering, not to cause it, but to allow it to happen because it will result in a greater possible good in the future. He said, I don't buy it. I said, why not? He says, because how can you tell me that that tsunami that happened in the early 2000s that killed 250,000 people, God let that happen for a greater possible good? How can you tell me that? And I said, well, how do you know it's not? Because maybe it was for a greater good that happened 5 minutes after. Maybe it's 50,000 years from now, and we just don't know the answer. But if you're saying that you know no good can come from it, then you're saying you have infinite knowledge of the future, and you're using that knowledge to deny the existence of a being who has infinite knowledge. Do you see what I'm saying? So he said, okay, I get it. Fine, it's possible. But that's when the conversation changed. He looked at me in a very different look in his eye now, and he said, I want to know this. How can you say that this God is good and values me or my mother when he let her die when I was 10? It's the same question. But now the philosophical rubber has met the existential road, friends. And now it's time for a real answer, not just theoretical. I said, look, I have no idea what it's like to lose someone that close to me at that tender of an age. I've had my share of losses, but never someone that close and never someone that when I was that young. I can't imagine what you go through. He called it a life-shaping moment. Obviously. Good gracious. I said, we've been talking for some time now, and you agreed that it's possible God could allow suffering for some greater possible good. And he said, yeah. I said, that's a nice theory. That's what it is. It's a theory. It's valid. It's a philosophical idea. It's a valid argument. But anybody can tell you that. Anybody who believes in some kind of a God can tell you what I just told you. It's a theory. Can I offer you something? For me as a Christian, it's more than a theory because it's actually a matter of history. God didn't allow some suffering for a theoretical good. He allowed terrible suffering on his own son as a matter of actual history, not for some highfalutin theoretical good that we could possibly dream up, but an actual greatest good there could be, the salvation of the world. He offered that to your mother, and he offers that to you. But you asked me one last question. You said, how could I know that this God values me or my mother? I said, look, I don't know. How do you value something? How do you know how much something is worth? I got things in my house. I've got DVDs of my wedding. I have my kids' first birthdays, pictures of those things. I got a lot of things, gifts they've given me. They're extraordinarily valuable to me. And there's a fire in that house. I'm getting my wife and my kids, and I'm leaving. I'm not going to risk my kid's father's life on stuff like that. I'll mourn their loss. But I'll tell you this. If one of my kids is in that house, or my wife's stuck in that house, I'm going to risk everything for them. You know how valuable something is by how much you're willing to pay for it. In a universe that does not care about your existence, as Lawrence Krauss says, all you are is a bit of pollution, cosmically speaking, can't give you value in an objective sense. But God paid an immeasurable price to show you and your mother that you have an immeasurable value and you could spend an immeasurable eternity with him. He offers that to you. He looked at me. He said, now that is worth believing. Friends, faith as a wishful thinking idea, I think that's just antithetical to Christian faith. I hope I've shown you at least this, that it's not just a blind leap. It's faith that has backed up by evidence and reasons for it. But there's never total evidence. You're never going to have complete evidence. There's going to be gaps. Blaise Pascal said that God has put enough evidence in this world to make belief in him a most reasonable thing, but has left enough evidence out so that faith in him based on reason alone is impossible. We have to have trust. You have trust with relationships you have in your life without perfect evidence, and God is asking the same thing, nothing more than faith in him without perfect evidence. But as I think I've shown, your life, you are valuable. The cross is the ultimate statement that you have eternal relevance because you are relevant to God, so much so that he sent his son for you and for me. Thank you so much for giving us a hearing. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
transition into a time for open Q&A. And so if you have a question you'd like to ask, please make your way down. We have one microphone here. And also, if you're the person who's closest to the inside in any row, if you do me a favor, there's a card and some pens on the inside of every row. And so what that is it's a place for you, if you could pass them down your row, it's a place for you to leave feedback. And then also, we won't have time to get to everyone's questions. And so we're going to prioritize the short, relevant questions from a skeptical perspective. So if you have a general comment, a question that's not off topic, or even just a question we don't get to tonight, feel free to write it on that form, and you can request to speak with someone at a later time. And so you can go ahead and start making your way up. The microphone is here if you have any questions, and you'll get some directions when you get up there.
I'm going to borrow a line from a friend. The first question is always the hardest question, so second question. Favorite color is blue. Actually, it's red. No, not at all, please.
Since you didn't have the short skeptic question, I have a different question to get things going.
Okay.
Coming from your Muslim background, as I understand it, one of the greatest obstacles to becoming a Christian is that they are so strictly monotheistic. How did you get over that hurdle of viewing Christianity as a tritheistic religion?
That's a great question. Thank you. What's your name? Beth. Thanks for the question, Beth. I want to unpack it a little bit if I could. The idea, Islam is a monotheistic religion, believing in one God, but it believes in what's called a monad concept of God. God is one in his nature and one in his person, whereas Christian monotheism is Trinitarian, believes that there's one God, but he exists in three centers of consciousness. He has three centers of consciousness, and so he is one, but there are three persons within the Trinity: Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Now, I remember when I was a Muslim, I would talk to my Christian friends. I'd say, explain the Trinity to me. And they have zero idea on how to explain the Trinity to me. And I'd say, well, sounds to me like you're just a confused tritheist. You think you're a monotheist, but you're just kind of a confused tritheist. And I would go ahead and debunk it. I also thought, by the way, that the idea of the Trinity insulted God's greatness. Now, you've heard the phrase, I think you've heard it in a very unfortunate way, but Allahu Akbar, right? You've heard this phrase on the news, and typically when you hear it, something bad happens on the news. But the reality is that most Muslims say Allahu Akbar all the time in common parlance. They just say it as a prayer and a praise. It means God is greater, and God's greatness is the central doctrine of all of Islam. So God is great, which means God is one and doesn't have partners. And I thought that if God the Father is God and God the Holy Spirit is God, why does God the Father need the Holy Spirit to help him if God is great? All these things. So I'm giving you a picture of what the problem actually was. But what I began to see was this. One, there is a logical consistency in the Trinity. I thought it was utterly illogical. There is a logical consistency within the Trinity. Now, if I were to ask this to say, how do I explain the Trinity? Many people would try to use analogies like water. You know, the water is H2O, but it can be solid, it can be liquid, it can be gas. The problem with that is the same body of water can't always be all three. So that's a problem because that's not actually how the Trinity says. The Trinity says God is one in his substance and three in his persons eternally. He's always the Son and the Father and the Holy Spirit. So the water analogy doesn't work. In other words, what I'm saying is this. Analogies break down. They don't work eventually, so just stop using them. They're just not going to work. If you do, sorry. But what I found is an explanation like this. The Trinity doesn't say that God is one nature and three in his nature. That's ridiculous. Or one in his personhood and three in his personhoods. That's similarly ridiculous. What it says is that God is one in his nature and three in his personhoods. Nature and personhood is not the same thing. Now, when you think of a person, I say, who's that person? You think of the body and personality of a particular individual. Who is this? I'm Abdu, the human being. That's what you think of. But I want to define personhood a little differently. I simply want to define personhood as a center of consciousness, that it's just the way in which one consciousness relates to other consciousnesses. Okay, that's all. So God is one what and three whos. So let me describe this a little better. If I were to say, what is this in its nature? What is its essence? I'd say non-living thing. It's got a whatness to it. You can point at me and say, what is that? And that'll be a little insulting, but you can still do it if that makes sense. What is that is I'm a living thing. I have a whatness, and so does the bottle. Whatness and a whatness. But you can't go to the bottle. Who is that? You don't say that to inanimate objects. Well, I guess with Siri you kind of do nowadays, but if they do it too long, they take you away. It doesn't have a who-ness. It doesn't have personhood. It lacks that quality. But you can say to me, who is that? I have not only a nature of what I am, but I have a personhood. I have a who I am. So nature and personhood are different. Something's what and something's who are different things. So God having one nature and three personhoods is not contradictory. Now, do you understand that 100%? Well, of course you don't. You know why? You're not tripersonal. You don't have three personhoods inside of you. So you're not going to get it 100%. But I'll tell you this. If you can understand God that fast, that easy, he was that simple to get, that should bother you. Because if you're talking about the creator of all things, the one who creates the entire universe, billions and billions of light years across, but also creates quarks and subatomic particles, and you can get him that easily, then you made him up. As opposed to a God who doesn't defy your logic, but who does transcend understanding. That's what the Trinity actually says. Now, how is this translated into not just theoretically possible, but actual? Remember what I said about God's greatness? A Muslim believes, and I believed, that God is truly great. He is incomparably great, and he would need nothing to be who he is. As a Muslim, I believe that God was personal. He had a personal quality to him. He had the ability to relate. The Quran describes God in personal ways, that he has volition and emotion and all these things. And so does the Bible. The Bible describes it in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8 as love, not loving, but that God is love. How do you explain these two things? If God is the uncreated being, the only uncreated being, and he's personal and relational, then when there was nothing else but him in existence, he was incapable of loving. Because love or relationship, relating, being merciful, being kind, being all these things, requires an object. You didn't walk in this room and just love, right? You know, I love. Well, you love who? I don't know, I just love. No one just loves. You gotta love someone or something. It requires a receptor. So God was incapable of being who he was when he was alone, unless he's a Trinitarian God, one in his nature, three in his person, eternally in community from eternity in the Trinity. Father loving the Son loving the Holy Spirit loving the Father and the Son, and on it goes. That community. God never needs anything to exist to be relational. He defines relationship as the eternal relator, which is why the Bible doesn't say God is loving. That's what the Bible says. God is love. He defines love. But why create you? To mess it up. He's got perfect relationship. What are you around for? He's not lonely. He doesn't create you so that he can have relationship. He creates you so that you can have it. It's a selfless act. He's not suddenly more God because you exist. He actually creates you so that you can have relationship. That's a God who is great. I wanted God to be great, and I found a God who is great in the triune God. Great question, Beth. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Oh, here we go.
Hello, my name is Colin.
Hi, Colin.
And I'm an atheist.
Hi, atheist. Colin.
That kind of goes into my question.
Yeah, sure.
You said earlier, and forgive me if I misheard you or misunderstood you,
Sure.
that a universe that with no God, human life would have no value. You say that.
Yeah, objectively speaking.
Objectively speaking.
Right.
Why is objectively speaking relevant?
Why is it relevant?
Yes. Why
Because-
do we need to be objectively valued?
Okay. Couple of reasons. You live that way already. You live that way now. You've come up and to this microphone and acted with incredible courtesy because I think you valued me as a person, okay? Which I very much appreciate, Colin. You did that because you acted that way. Now, if someone came up and acted rudely to me, and I acted rudely back to you, you'd take offense, and you'd think it was wrong for me to do that. I hope you would think that would be wrong on an objective sense. But if the two of us, I'm bigger than you, okay? Now, if you take offense, I can just say, tough, and you gotta live with it, all right? Now, if we live that way in society, we have one set of people, a whole set of people who have more guns, more bombs, and more technology, and they simply devalue those people. Those people just don't have value. And I enslave those people, and the rest of the world says, you can't do that. And I say, tough. It's all subjective. Who are you to tell me I'm wrong? And by the way, you can't. I have more guns. That's why it's important. None of us live with a true belief in subjective morality, nor do we live with a true belief in subjective value of human beings. We all live, and you gave me the greatest courtesy possible of acting courteously to me because you valued me. That's what you did when you came up to this microphone. You live that way all the time. Now, I'm saying that that doesn't even exist absent a God who can give us that transcendent value. It's a wonderful question, and I think you exhibited the very thing that I'm talking about in your courtesy here. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. If you guys just want to line up and do it, that'd be great too.
Dr. Murray, I really enjoyed your talk today.
Thank you.
I did have a question. It was a bit skeptical.
Yeah.
You seem to arrange this defense for belief in God as an assault against human evolution. However, three of the people that you quoted, namely my boy Archbishop Rowan Williams, John Lennox, and Francis Collins are all ardent evolutionists. In fact, Francis Collins has gone so far as to publicly state that intelligent design is an intellectually bankrupt theory, and he has established an institute to try and convince people that faith and evolution can be synthesized. So I'd like to ask you, do you think there can be a synthesis between faith and evolution? And if so, why do you use the argument against evolution as your primary argument for God?
Thank you very, very much for that. Great question, and Nathan will answer it. I am interested in getting his perspective, but I'll tell you, great question. Francis Collins does believe in evolution, as you've rightly stated. In fact, the institute he started is called BioLogos, which is a bunch of scientists who believe that evolution is the way in which we've evolved, hence the name, but they also believe in God. Now, I've been to symposia with the BioLogos folks, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing their position on this, nor Francis Collins's. When he's talking about intelligent design as a bankrupt philosophy or a bankrupt way to look at things, I don't think he's referring to the idea that all intelligent design is itself bankrupt. If you read The Language of God, the book he wrote after the Human Genome Project was done, he actually says that that DNA itself is the instruction manual for creating a human being. And he believes, and the BioLogos folks don't believe that evolution is inherently random. They might say it's unguided in some processes, but it is the means by which God created human beings. So in one sense, they are intelligent design people because they believe that God has built into the system a design to create human beings. That's what I would, hopefully I'm not mischaracterizing his statement. In fact, what's interesting is, you may have seen this at Johns Hopkins University. He was speaking with our boss, Ravi Zacharias, at Johns Hopkins of what does it mean to be human. And I didn't show you, I was going to show you a slide today, but I decided not to, where he shows what DNA looks like, looking down the axis of the double helix, and he showed it next to the rose window of York Minster Cathedral. And he pointed out something. He said, when you look at the rose window of York Minster Cathedral, it's dazzling and gorgeous and beautiful in its design and artistry. And then he showed what DNA looks like. And there wasn't even a comparison in terms of the beauty. DNA dazzled everyone. Everyone in the audience wowed out loud. And he picked up a guitar and worshiped. So he does believe that there is an intelligence behind all that. He does believe that there's an artistry behind all that. I think what he's talking about is the way intelligent design is actually portrayed absent evolution. I think he thinks it's scientifically bankrupt. I happen to disagree with that view. I don't think that intelligent design is bankrupt in that way. I'm not quite sure. You quoted John Lennox as well. John Lennox is a colleague of ours. I spent a lot of time with John. I'm not sure that he would be sort of an ardent evolutionist in the sense that you made. I'm not just disagreeing with you. I'm just not saying that that's the case. And of course, Rowan Williams as well. I think, look, what Paul says in Romans is that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and God raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. That's it. There's other things that you can attend to that, and I think people like Francis Collins and others, those who go into the evolutionary paradigm, are Christians. I'm in not in a position to judge their orthodoxy on this. You ask them, how are you saved? By grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, and the Bible is the sole authority. They would affirm all those things, and I think that essentially puts them within the pale of orthodoxy. I think there's a counter perspective, though, that is skeptical of the evolutionary story that needs to be weighed against it. Now, what I've seen has been actually quite refreshing is you have the Biologos Institute of Christians who affirm evolution, and then you have a group like Reasons to Believe who don't affirm evolution but also have common values on the idea that God is in there somewhere. And they come together for symposia and they respectfully engage in the dialogue. I think the biggest problem with Christianity today is not that we disagree, but that we disagree so disagreeably. That's the big problem. And these in-house debates are so loud that the neighbors are hearing it. And I think it's causing people who are skeptical to say, if they can't agree, why should I? We do agree. We actually fundamentally do agree on the idea of design. Francis Collins, as you know, no intellectual lightweight, does believe fundamentally in design, but does believe in evolution, but does put his faith in God. And you ask him why, he'd say for independent reasons like the resurrection, like human morality and all these things. So do I believe you can do that? Sure. Am I skeptical of it personally? Yeah, that's my position. But brilliant people have come to these conclusions. And I would leave it with this. They would also say that the existence of the very chemicals and the very processes of evolution are actually the very things that demonstrate God's existence. That's their commonality. Now, you asked me the other question. I'm sorry to go a little longer, but this is a terribly important question. When you look at an atheist like Raymond Tallis wrote a book called Aping Mankind. And I think you know this book. Is that why you're smiling?
I had a beer with him. I was at dinner with Francis Collins 2 years ago.
Were you really? Oh, you read his book, Aping Mankind, then?
No, but we shared a few jokes.
Okay, good. Well, he's a very funny guy. If you read the book, it's hysterical. He's an atheist, as you know, and he is a neuroscientist and a Darwinist. And he makes the point, along with people like Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist philosopher, that if evolution was the way you explain the human mind, there would be no mind to explain evolution, because it's all random processes. And you wouldn't trust a computer that way, would you? You do your studies with a computer, with a laptop. If I told you that the laptop you're using was made in a junkyard by me just blowing a strong wind through the junkyard for 50,000 years and that laptop came by accident, would you trust it? Why would you trust your brain if it was made that way? Because your mind is not your brain. And even an atheist like Raymond Tallis acknowledges that. So great question. Thank you so much.